Hey, what's going on, DDO players? Axel here. So, there is a lot to discuss in this video. Patch 48.4 is coming, and there are just a lot of huge changes for DDO in this patch. A lot of really important stuff that you need to be aware of. So, let's just get started and go through it. A couple things before I get started. I have put timestamps in the description and they should incorporate themselves into the timeline. This is going to be a long video, but feel free to skip around, as you see fit if you don't have enough time to go through all of it. Also, about 70% of you I noticed in YouTube analytics aren't subscribed. It would be really helpful if some of you who are watching would consider subscribing. Okay, so I guess to give an overall impression, what were the changes in this patch? Okay, first of all, the patch is not yet into the game, so it is in preview right now. So everything I say in this video could potentially change. Probably won't change, but it could potentially change. It's not final yet. And if there are any significant changes, I will put them in a pinned comment below, okay? Or if there's any significant corrections that I missed, anything I got wrong, okay? All right. The changes that we're going to discuss today are spell changes, spell power changes, and buffs, a variety of buffs and nerfs to various combat styles. Two-handed fighting getting a nerf specifically. Also, some updates they put out on Friday discussing things like Warlock buffs. And also, I'll give a little bit of information on the new raid that's coming up because that's in preview as well. So let's start with spells and spell power. This is what the developers had to say. Nukers are fairly strong right now overall, but we've identified two particular outliers, alchemists and fire sorcerers. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. I mean, pretty much everyone knew that alchemists and fire sorcerers were the best builds in the game, and it's not surprising to see those nerfed, okay? So let's continue. There are several factors involved in why they're ahead of others, but one of the largest factors in both is both their top end spells. Multi-Vial, which is Alchemist from Alchemist, and Meteor Swarm, Meteor Swarm, is an arcane spell, are significantly ahead of their fellow top-end nuker spells, largely due to good damage dice, below average cooldowns, and significant boosts to caster levels. As a result, we brought those spells down to a much closer level to Acid Well, Iceberg, and Thunderstroke, and met in the middle on cooldowns, buffing those three spells in the process. While this won't solve all disparities between nukers and other types of characters, we believe this brings them a little closer together, makes other kinds of wizards and sorcerers a little more viable, and makes partying with those nukers less one-sided. And they continue. On the other side of the spectrum, a lot of offensive spellcasters that don't have access to the wizard and sorcerer spell list needed a boost. This patch targets offensive spells across a variety of builds and aims to bring up the floor of the spellcaster spectrum considerably. We have also fixed key bugs with Druid to allow its premier CC ability, Earthquake, to correctly scale its duration and Reaper mode. We have also made a special effort to target underused spellbooks such as Artificer by giving them access to key offensive spells to round out their repertoire. Finally, we have additional plans in certain enhancement trees in a later post that addresses some remaining concerns with Spellsinger, our Arcanotech specifically. We expect these changes to significantly boost the viability of Divine, Druid, Bard, and Artificer spellcasters across all levels of play. Okay, so basically, in a nutshell, what the developers are saying here is they want to bring alchemists and sorcerers down, and they want to bring other types of offensive casters and nukers specifically up, because this is kind of a pass on nukers, not really DC casters. Okay, so let's start with some of the changes to alchemist, sorcerer, and wizard spells, and this is where some of the biggest nerfs in this patch exist. Okay, so they buffed some key lesser used spells in these spell books: Iceberg, Thunderstroke, Acid Well. So they reduced the cooldowns, so that maybe will make those spells more useful. They've made significant nerfs to two big things here, which are the two ones when you're concerning arcane casters and alchemists that you want to be concerned with here. So the big nerfs are to Meteor Swarm, which is has been one of the best just nuking spells for arcanes. Okay, so they've raised the cooldown to 6 seconds for sorcerers, 9 seconds for wizards. So that's a significant nerf. Okay, they've also touched the max caster level for Meteor Swarm. So as you can see on the bottom here, Meteor Swarm's max caster level has been reduced from 30 to 20 to match Iceberg, Thunderstroke, Acid Well, Multi-Vial. So Meteor Swarm is now worse after level 20 because the caster level is now capped at 20. So some significant nerfs to Meteor Swarm. Okay, the next one and the big one are the nerfs to Alchemist. So multi-vial, which is their multi-vial spells, which is kind of their best thing. I haven't played an Alchemist, but that's what I hear and that's what I see when I group with them. They've been dramatically changed. Okay, so multi-vial's cooldown has been raised to 9 seconds. Multi-vial's damage dice has been changed to 1d4 plus 3 per element per caster level per projectile. So that's a reduction. Master of Spell Vials, which is a feat, no longer applies to multi-vial, and multi-vial spells now cost 40 spell points for both the core spell and Bombardier SLA version, so they're making it more spell point costly by a lot. I believe it was 20 before. So multi-vial has been nerfed a lot. Okay, so its cooldown is bigger, it does less damage, and it costs more spell points. And you don't want access to Master Spell Vials no longer applies to multi-vial. So some big Alchemist nerfs, really heavy-handed Alchemist nerfs from what I'm reading. This plus the Spellpower nerfs, which we'll discuss here in a little bit. But yeah, Meteor Swarm and multi-vial really being affected here. And they've erased some of the lesser use spells, so we'll see how that impacts things. But that's what you need to be concerned about as Arcane spellcasters in Alchemist in that regard. Okay, let's move on to some other buffs they made. So they made buffs for bards. So I'm not going to go through all these, but here you go. If you want to pause the video, you can read these. But they've made some buffs to some lesser used bard spells. A Cleric Favorite Soul. So they touched a lot of these unused spells. So spells in the Cleric Favorite Soul spell book, like things like that no one ever used, like not Sunbolt, I'm sorry, a lot of people use Sunbolt, but like Chaos Hammer, Unholy Blight, Inflict Critical Wounds. That stuff has not, like before, was no one ever touched that really. No one really used. There was actually a lot of spells in the Divine Spellbook that really don't get used, but a lot of stuff here was buffed a lot. So a lot of these lesser known spells, lesser used spells, may be worth using now. And if you are a Divine Nuker type character, you want to look at some of these spells that you've ignored for a long time and test them out, try them out. I went on Lamannia and I tried some of the Inflict, serious wounds and some of these other spells, and it's a very, very, very considerable buff. So maybe some of these are worth using now. And they even buffed some spells like Destruction, which were already really well used, except now if you fail, on your Destruction attempt, you do more damage. Okay, and then things like Firestorm have been buffed as well. So even though that still is a weird targeting issue, but yeah, a lot of these Cleric Favorite Souls spells got buffed. And moving on now to Druids, same thing for Druids. A lot of these lesser known, lesser used spells, are getting buffs. Okay, so a lot of these spells, if you play one of these classes, you want to check out these spells here and test them out when this patch goes live. Okay, let's move on now to some additional spell-related changes. Really, I'm not going to read all these, but really the most important thing to point out is that the buffs they made to the Inflict Critical Wounds spells, so the mass spells, they will only use the newer versions of their dice to affect enemies. So they're not being buffed in terms of their ability to heal undead players, so heal Pale Masters. It's just their nuking ability against monsters. Okay, so let's move now on to the combat style changes. So a lot of the melee combat styles, really all of them I think, were either buffed or nerfed. So let's go ahead and start by reading the developer post on this once again. So when looking at the spread, popularity, and usability of combat styles, we came up with a few concrete goals. We wanted to boost the DPS and versatility of single weapon fighting, expanding its usage outwards to better cater to hybrid builds. We also wanted to tone down the DPS of two-handed fighting slightly while leaving the AoE capabilities, area of effect capabilities, top tier, as that niche is part of what makes two-handed fighting so compelling. We looked at the DPS of two-weapon fighting and found that while we think it's in a balanced place offensively, the companion feats for two-weapon fighting needed a lot of help to become more compelling defensive options. We ran through several iterations of two-weapon blocking before we decided to simply remove it entirely, merging it with two-weapon defense, and we also wanted to further incentivize it by adding a MRR cap boost. Natural fighting needed adjusting to match two-handed fighting, but it also needed some extra special incentives at the top so that both bears and wolves would be happy switching their feats to the new perfect combat style feat. Finally, we wanted to add more compelling combat options for shield fighting. Its perfect combat style feat is very defensive, but that's shield's niche, and we wanted the style to retain its defensive elements at the top end. These are also coupled with some buffs to the Vanguard tree's tier 5 options to help make that tree more of a competitive choice versus Kensei or Knight of the Chalice. And you can see those changes in the other thread, which we'll get to in a minute. Okay. All right. So let's start with single weapon fighting. So the main changes here that you can see that they've made for single weapon fighting is they're trying to make it better for hybrid builds. So that would be things like Eldritch Knight, for example. They want to make it better in kind of, I guess, more of a niche for those builds. So this is what they're changing here. For your offhand items that are in your main hand, rune arms and orbs now grant when you Vorpal Strike, your next spell automatically crits. So if you're running, like a single weapon fighting melee, like Cleric or Eldritch Knight or something, you now, if you have an orb or a rune arm in your offhand, you can get more automatic spell crits. That's just on a Vorpal, so that would be just on a 20. So 1 in every 20 swings now is going to give you an automatic crit afterwards. So that's pretty nice. And also having nothing in your offhand. So if you're just using single weapon fighting and don't have an orb or anything on your offhand, it'll just give you a damage boost. So it'll increase your ability score modifier to damage by 25%. So that's nice. Also with single weapon fighting, perfect single weapon fighting got some changes. So now also increases your ability score modifier to damage by 25%. Okay, perfect single weapon fighting now also grants an additional 10 combat style bonus to melee power. So single weapon fighting is getting buffed. That's cool. Interesting. I mean, I think that it's pretty clear that two-handed fighting was the best combat style, so I think it makes sense to buff some of these other combat styles to make them more viable in terms of making more sense to not just play two-handed fighting. So let's move on now to one of the biggest changes in this patch, which is nerfs to two-handed fighting. So let's read here what they had to say about the changes. So two-handed fighting. The two-handed fighting, improved two-handed fighting, and greater two-handed fighting feats now increase your ability score modifier to damage by 25%. Perfect two-handed fighting now also increases your ability score modifier to damage by 25%. That's really not very clear in terms of what they're doing. You kind of got to dig into it a little bit. But basically what this does is, assuming that your character has all the two-handed fighting feats, this now nerfs the ability score modifier from your damage from 3 to 2.5, okay? So this equates to a 17% reduction, around a 17% reduction in the effect of the ability score modifier. So a reduction in that portion of your character's damage. So what does this mean when it comes to overall damage? Well, it's going to vary by character, but according to my math for my main character, that's a level 30 character with all the two-handed fighting feats, it equates to a range of around 6 to 7% overall damage loss. I talked to some other players and I talked to another player and he is getting a little bit higher than me, around the same. So I think a lot of people are saying a 6 to 7% overall damage loss. This is going to vary character to character, just depending on what percentage of your overall damage comes from your ability modifier. It depends on how much damage you're getting from your equipment. It's going to depend on how high your ability modifier is to begin with. So if you're running around with 130, like 130 strength, and another character is running around with 80 strength, the character with 130 strength is going to be impacted more, assuming both characters have the same gear, just because a bigger portion of your damage is coming from the ability modifier, okay? So the way it worked before is 3 times your ability modifier was added to your damage. Now, only 2.5 times your ability modifier is going to be added to your character's damage from these feats. Assuming you have all two-handed fighting feats. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking at. I think for most characters, assuming you're well geared and built at level 30, you're probably seeing like a 5, 6, 7% somewhere in there damage loss overall. Okay, so was this necessary? Was two-handed fighting overpowered? I don't think so, and of course I'm biased because I play a two-handed fighting character and I have for years and years, even when it was bad. So I was a little bit surprised by this nerf because I don't see two-handed fighting as overpowered. Yes, it was hands down the best of the melee combat styles. That's true, but still in the meta right now, it's like, especially the high school meta, it's still dominated by casters and ranged. It's not like particularly like casters like alchemists and sorcerers. Granted, they are getting big nerfs, more nerfs in two-handed fighting, but it's just I never saw two-handed fighting, even though it's good. It's not. I don't think it's overpowered right now. Like, in fact, I don't think we've ever really in the game seen a point in the game where it's always been like where it's really ever been melee's been like the best choice. You know, ranged and casters just inherently are better just on a fundamental level than melee in this game, just because they have a huge DPS advantage in that they don't have to close distance and they can attack from range. So all all the time spent for melee characters running to enemies, that's all DPS loss for melees, because compared to ranged and casters, because ranged and casters don't have to close distance, they can hit people from across across the room. And furthermore, melee gets a big defensive penalty practically, because when you're playing a melee, you have to actually go up to monsters and hit them, whereas ranged and casters can have the huge advantage of being able to kite, being able to attack at range safely. So I don't think we've ever seen a point in the game that I can recall where it's been like the most meta, the best choice has been to run a melee. Looking back the past few years, the best things to play have been Alchemist. Before that, it was Inquisitive. Before that, it was a Warlock. So yeah, I'm not really seeing why they need to nerf two-handed fighting. I thought it would make more sense for them to just buff the other combat styles, but it is what it is. The thing is, I play two-handed fighting ever since it was bad until now. I played it for years, so I'll still play it just because it's what I'm passionate about, but it sucks. Okay, let's talk about shield users now. So there is a new feat, Greater Shield Mastery. So this is a sword and board characters. You're getting some buffs here. So with this new feat, basically from the Greater Shield Mastery feat, they're getting more PRR and damage, and there's also another feat called Perfect Shield Mastery, where they're getting more damage, PRR, and AC. I'm not going to read all the little details here, but you can pause the video if you want. But that's essentially what's happening. Sword and shield users are getting some buffs as well. On now to buffs for druids and natural fighting. So the natural fighting feat now increases your ability score modifier to damage by 25%, all in bear or dire bear form. They got a new feat called Perfect Natural Fighting, which, while in bear form, your two-handed ability modifier increases by 0.5, 25%, and your bear's form's bonus to armor class goes up by 5%. And when in wolf form, you get a 15% confidence bonus to maximum hit points, which, by the way, just note is the same type bonus as epic defensive fighting, so that won't stack. And you also gain plus 2d6 sneak attack dice. Okay, finally, let's talk about two-weapon fighting. So two-weapon fighting is probably getting the least of all the, when it comes to the buffs, are getting the least of all the buffs, I would say. So what's being changed is the two-weapon blocking feat was merged into the two-weapon defense feat, and was also on top of that been given another been given a plus 10 MRR cap. Okay, so that's the changes two-weapon fighting is getting, but they're not getting, as the developers indicated, really any offensive changes like say sword and board was getting, or single weapon fighting was getting, or anything like that. Okay, so let's move on now to enhancement changes and spell power changes. So this includes the biggest nerf in this patch. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's first of all read what the developers had to say in their initial post here on the Lamannia forums, and I don't think I've mentioned this, but I'll link all these developer posts and threads and stuff down below in the description. Okay, this is what they had to say about these changes. So the buffs we have done to these enhancement trees were centered around two goals: to provide a boost to spellcasting ability for Bard and Artificer, and to help equalize the disparity between Vanguard's Tier 5 selection versus Knight of the Chalice and or Kensei. We hope that these focus changes encourage a wider variety of offensive spellcasters. Artificer in particular suffered from a lack of immunity bypass, and we think this method, tying it directly to your rune arm shots, bridges an important thematic and mechanical gap. And then they move on to talk about enhanced spell power, which is the biggest change in this patch, I would say. Okay, enhanced spell power causes several significant long-term gearing problems for both the casters who had elements represented and the casters who did not. Either you had access to your element, which forced you to always wear the appropriate belt, or you did not, and you were left behind by a large margin of power. This change, it removes a significant amount of disparity between elemental types of offensive and defensive casting, and was a necessary step to the comprehensive offensive spell pass we are doing at the same time. And they continue, the changes to Shifter are primarily bug fixes, but we also wanted to give an avenue for advancing out of the fatigue that occurs after shifting for shifters that don't get Tireless Rage from Barbarian. In addition, we wanted to bump the durability of Beast-Hide shifters slightly. We're keeping an eye on the overall placement of shifters and may continue to buff shifters in the future if needed. Okay, so we'll go through the enhancement changes, like they mentioned Vanguard in a second, but I want to just briefly discuss what this means for enhanced spell power. So to put kind of the developer post, to put it in more layman's terms, I guess. So there are several different types of stacking spell power in DDO. So there's equipment spell power, you got insightful, you've got quality, you've got enhanced spell power. So what they're doing is they're taking out one of the stacking layers from the game, and that's enhanced spell power. And enhanced spell power was primarily represented in a variety of Ravenloft belts, and these are both heroic and legendary belts. And there's one for several different elements. So there's one that's fire and acid. There's one that's devotion, that's for healing. So, and that's really the main place you got this type of spell power. So what happened was, like most casters that were optimizing their gear sets, particularly at endgame, were all wearing one of these enhanced spell power belts, because you kind of have to. It's the main source of this spell power, and it stacks with everything. So, for example, my character was wearing the legendary silver thread belt because it has enhanced devotion on it, which stacked with other sources of devotion. So they're just changing. They're basically removing enhanced spell power from the game. So all these enhanced spell power on these different belts, it's now going to be just regular equipment spell power. So, for example, the silver thread belt that had enhanced devotion, it's just going to be equipment bonus to devotion. So it's not going to stack with other regular sources of devotion. Okay, so that's basically the main change. What they mentioned in their comment there was they didn't like a couple things about the belts. So there was a disparity there, they mentioned, between some casters that had it and some didn't. So certain spell power types, so I think Force was one of them, for example, didn't have a belt that had enhanced spell power on it. So because of that, those spell power types just lost straight up 202 spell power, which is what happened here. And I'm a bit surprised by this nerf, because I thought that they would actually go in a different direction and start introducing different sources of enhanced spell power, but they didn't do that. They wanted to just take enhanced spell power out of the game. So what this equates to is that most players that are, anyone that's using these belts, which I think is most players that have an optimized gear set in game, so it's a lot of players, you're just going to lose 202 spell power flat out. So that's a big kind of broad nerf to spellcasters in general. Okay, so if you are using one of these belts, it's the belt's gonna, I don't know if I'd say it's worthless now, but it's much less good than it was. So what do I think about this? In concept, I'm actually okay with this, because just in concept, because we have too many. I've said this in previous videos that DDO has just completely gone crazy over the past several years. They keep adding more and more and more and more and more and more stacking effects for everything, and that's what it's done. Like, there's so many sources of spell power, damage, just all so many stacking sources now, and what that's done, it's made, in my opinion, it's made gearing an endgame unnecessarily complicated and unnecessarily annoying. And also what it's done is it's made gearing, it kind of introduced this concept that I call, and a lot of other players call, gear Tetris, where there's so many stacking effects, and you have to really, it's really complicated to get a optimized gear set in game. And what that causes is a situation where, since there's so many stacking effects, anytime you want to change one piece of gear out, basically there's a Tetris or a domino effect where effectively, if you want to change one piece of gear, you got to change out like your entire gear set. And it's just made gearing really inflexible, in my opinion. So in concept, I'm okay with them stripping out some of these multiple layers of stacking effects, because I think there are too many in DDO as it is. However, on the other hand, this change screws up those of us who have who now have to reshuffle gear sets. Like you guys saw in the past few weeks, 2-3 weeks, I just made a new gear set video. I just made my gear set. Granted, I was using the Ravenloft belt not 100% of the time. I was using it kind of as a swap, but I was using it a good chunk of the time. And now my gear set, because of this change, like I would need to, like I'm thinking like it's probably not optimized anymore. So if I want to change that, it's not really the farming out new gear to fit stuff in new slots that bothers me. It's more the fact that it's so inflexible to change your gear set in DDO, because they have like jewelers toolkits are expensive, and for some reason you have to pay to unslot augments, and that stuff doesn't drop well at all in the game. Jewelers toolkits, so that's probably the most annoying part of it. And also there's things such as Sharn crafting, to where you can't break down an already crafted item, for example, for your, say your legendary like Sharn goggles. So your legendary collective sight, for example, you can't strip out the 2 effects like and get like say half your ingredients back. You can't even overwrite effects. You have to actually just farm out a new set of goggles and recraft. So that's annoying. Okay, and I guess my other problem with this change is that it's a widespread nerf. So it's, instead of being a nerf with a chisel here, it's more of a nerf with a sledgehammer, in that it's hitting a lot of builds that aren't overpowered. I don't think my character is overpowered. I don't think my build is particularly meta, but I'm getting double whammied with this this patch, because I'm getting hit with the 2-handed fighting nerf and the spell power nerf. So, you know, that's one problem I have. I think if they would have done a more pointed nerfing to certain spells that are like overpowered, that may have been better. Or if they want to just do this broad nerf, they can enhance spell power out. I hope they go back afterwards and kind of touch spells on a more individual basis. So for example, just to put it in a healing context, because I play, you know, a cleric, there are some healing spells that I think I would understand if they wanted to nerf, because I think they're really strong. So renewal, for example, is really, really strong in DDO, and like I would understand if they wanted to nerf that. It would make sense. But then there's other healing abilities, like for example, Radiant Burst. Before this nerf, my Radiant Burst with my well, actually after this nerf, with my Radiant Burst, my positive spell power now being down to 600 if you take out the 202. So what it does now is Radiant Burst doesn't even fill up half of my character's health bar, and that's despite being tier 5 Radiant Servant. So with high caster level, that's despite 3 meta magics applied. I have maximized, intensify, and empower healing and multiple layers of healing up. It doesn't even fill up half my health bar. So is that healing spell overpowered? You might argue it's in a good place, but certainly it's not. I don't think it's worthy of a big nerf when we're talking minus 202 spell power. For a lot of builds, that equates to 20% or so of their spell power gone. So in fact, when it comes to Radiant Burst for my character, I actually take Intensify specifically and solely, basically solely, to boost Radiant Burst, because I feel like it needs it to be viable as kind of a group heal. So while I think it would be reasonable to nerf a spell like Renewal, the problem with this kind of nerf is that you're hitting a lot of things. Instead of the specific spells that may need nerfing, you're hitting a lot of ones that I don't think. So that's my other complaint. So I feel very, I guess, mixed, you could say, when it comes to the enhanced spell power change. I have very mixed feelings about it. Okay, now let's get to some of the enhancement tree buffs and other changes they made. Okay, so I'm not going to go over all these, but I will show them on the screen. If you want to pause the video, that's fine. But here's just quickly some of the changes they made. So Vanguard, that's in the Paladin and Fighter tree, got some buffs here. I guess the most notable one, so you can see they have a new tier 5, which gives them a plus critical damage multiplier on a roll of 19 to 20. So that's some pretty nice damage increase for Vanguard. Artificer, Art Technician, tier 5 got some inability to strip lightning immunity or electric immunity. Spellsinger, they got some enhancements merged so that the tree is now more action point efficient. So there's the changes on the screen for them. And then on to Shifter. Shifter trees got fatigue immunity while shifting and plus 10 PRR to threatening shift, which is in the base Shifter tree, I believe. Okay, so there's the changes for those. Let's now talk about the new raid. So some more positive things to talk about. All right, so here's what the developers had to say about the new raid, which is called, this is the Feywild raid that, as you know, which is now coming out, which Feywild released end of last year, but the raid is now being introduced this patch. So the raid is called the Dryad and the Demigod, and the main thing you want to know about this raid, and the main interesting thing, is that it's a musical raid. So basically, what that means is the dungeon master is not talking to you, he's singing to you. There's a lot of music in the raid, so at least the first time or two you run this raid, if you run with sound off, or if you listen to music or something normally while you're playing instead of the game sounds, then you'll want to definitely turn those on for the raid at first. Now, I haven't run the entire raid on Lamannia on the preview server, but I did go on the preview server and step into the raid, and I did listen to the first part of the raid, and the music's very cool. It's a very folky type of very folky type of music style that you would expect from Feywild. It's very good. It's quite good from what I heard. And if you want to hear an example of it, Cordovan actually did, the community manager actually did showed off a portion of the raid as well, also just the beginning, so you can hear what that looks like. I will link that below, and as well as note the timestamp in the description below. Okay, finally, let's talk about what the developers have done as far as Warlocks and buffs to Warlock. So this was just recently added on Friday, so this is an update. So let's see what they have to say. So first up, Warlocks are getting a bump targeted at their epic levels. Unlike other spellcasting classes, in which we could significantly boost their spellbook as part of the spell revamp, Warlock's main source of damage wasn't changed for this preview. That means that with our plan to globally adjust spellcasting by modifying Spellpower availability in exchange for a greatly boosted suite of spells, Warlock still needed some extra help. To address this, we're planning on refactoring their 2 epic level feats, Epic Eldritch Blast and Epic Arcane Eldritch Blast, into feats that allow your blast dice and pack dice to scale with your epic levels. This is going to shake out to a small bump in mid epics and a larger one at cap. It's also going to let us differentiate those 2 feats a bit, but right now are pretty similar to one another. We also spent some time on the visuals of Warlock, but you'll need to wait until the next preview to see that stuff in action. The other thing we'd like to take some time to talk about is Alchemist. As many of you have reported, our changes to multi-vial that standardized it to other high-level spells is hurting both their AoE damage as intended, but also their single target damage, which we would like to improve. Furthermore, we would also like to take this time to help early game Alchemist as it levels through early to mid heroics. To address this, we're planning on creating a new suite of stacking damage over time, singles target spells throughout spells levels 2 and 3. These spells will also be boosted by the Master of Spell Vials feat, which will boost that feat's effectiveness and mean that the new spells will continue to be effective past heroic levels. Stacking damage over time spells have the potential to greatly improve boss DPS without adding more to their AoE potential. We hope that these new spells will help alchemists of all levels tackle high hit point monsters, and we certainly hope that they can help boost our alchemists of low levels by filling out their early game attack chain. We are also spending this time ironing out a ton of alchemist bugs, and we're thankful for the diligent bug reporting on that front. Okay, so long story short, Warlocks are getting some more damage, and alchemists are getting some help with single target spells, as well as some help in early levels. I know one of the complaints about Alchemist is that it's not very good in the very early game, so they're adding some stuff to help out with that. Okay, so let's move on now to my overall thoughts. Okay, so the 2 big nerfs to my character, it personally sucks. There's no other way to point out. I mean, whether or not a nerf is deserved or not, it always sucks to have your character nerf. It's not fun. And like I explained already, I don't think the two-handed fighting nerf was necessary, but I'm biased. I'll point that out. I'm very biased. But personally, I played two-handed fighting for years, and I've done that because that's just the archetype I enjoy. So I played it when it was bad. I played it when it was good. And if it gets bad again, granted, this is only a 6 to 7% nerf or so for me, so it's going to be it's significant nerf, but not a character breaking nerf really. But if two-handed fighting falls behind again in the future and gets bad, I'll still play it unless I change my mind. But as of right now, I intend to continue to play it because I played it when it was bad. I played it when it was good, so it's not really going to affect me. And that's the one good thing about in DDO. If you play what you love and you play it because you're passionate about it, you're not going to be hurt as much by nerfs, even though it's always going to suck if your character gets nerfs. it's not, they can't ever change your character, because what you value in the character is what you're passionate about and not just the numbers. Whereas if you play like an alchemist because you are basically, if you're playing alchemist just because it was the best build in the game and you want to just play what's the best, then you're setting yourself up for really a problem here, because they're going to continuously nerf the best builds in the game. It's just the way it is. I mean, if something gets out of hand, they're going to nerf it. So you can't really you have a lot more leniency to complain if you're playing it because you're passionate about it. So if you're playing Alchemist because, not because it was good, because you were passionate about it, you have more more of a right to complain. Because I think if for all you players out there that were playing like Alchemist solely because it was really really good, you can't really be too upset when it gets nerfed, because you can't. I mean, you can because it sucks, but at the same time, you should have known it was coming. Like, it's obvious if you play a build that's overperforming, you gotta expect a nerf. Okay. So I guess a couple things I want to continue on about the Alchemist nerfs here. So players do have a really good, I think, legitimate complaint, is that SSG, and I guess maybe Turbine before that, has shown a pattern of releasing things overpowered, letting them linger for a long period of time, and then nerfing them later. Okay, so they've done this with Warlock, they did it with Inquisitive, and now they've done it with Alchemist. Okay, and I think that, and also to be fair, they have released plenty of things that weren't overpowered as well. They've released, so like Vistani Knife Fighter, Falconry, for example. These things weren't overpowered on release at all. So it's not like everything they release is overpowered, but a good chunk of them, and specifically the last two classes, have been overpowered on release, and they kind of let it linger for a long time. So I think that for SSG, I wish they would stop doing that, because it is a bad look to release things that are just like overpowered, and then once they're once I guess most players have bought them, then kind of nerfing them later, it's just not a good look. I'm not saying that SSG is purposely making stuff overpowered to sell it and then nerfing it later, but I don't think that's going on. That's not what I think, but it certainly gives that to a lot of players. It certainly visually give that impression, and it doesn't look good. Here's the thing: Alchemist has been out for like a full year. Also, it's the other thing to note here. I think they should be more proactive on their nerfs, because I think that it's unreasonable to expect SSG to release a class perfectly balanced every single time. It's just not reasonable. I don't know how many people they have testing it in game, or not in game, but on their staff. Maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's 10 people. It's impossible to get data, especially in a game as complex as DDO. It's going to be impossible to get sufficient data in development, because when it goes out live, instead of having 10 people play it, you're having thousands of people potentially play it. So it's just, the thousands of people are going to find things that the development team is just practically not going to be able to get. And I think it's unreasonable to expect the developers to perfectly balance things out of the gate every time. However, they also shouldn't let it linger for so long, because the longer they let it linger, the worse it is, because the more people buy it overpowered, the more people put money into gearing and all this stuff to these classes, put a lot of time into these classes, and it just hurts more. The nerfs hurt more the longer it goes out. So I think instead of waiting a year, and Alchemist has been out for a full year, I think instead of waiting that long to do nerfs, they should be more proactive here and do it after, I don't know, 3 to 4 months. I know what I think they would probably say in response to that is, we needed to give it time. We wanted the meta to develop so we can understand the class, how it's being played, where it's strong, where it's not, so that we can do an accurate of nerf as we can, or not over nerf it, not under nerf it. But I think the problem with that is, like I said before, the longer you wait, the worse the more upset players are going to get, and the worse it hurts players. So I would say that they should probably, I would suggest they be more proactive and look at balance changes after like 3 or 4 months, and make some changes. If stuff is obviously overpowered, like like some of this Alchemist stuff, like multi-vial, then address that after 3 or 4 months. Yes, you won't have as much information and you won't be able to make as accurate of a nerf or a buff as you could if you waited a year versus 3 to 4 months. But you know what? You can always buff it later. If after 3 months you nerf it and you found out that, oh, it's over nerfed, well, then 6 months later, 9 months later, whatever, you get more information, you can buff it again. So, okay, so let's just be more proactive. I think that would be better for players. So hopefully they consider that going forward. I know they've got a new enhancement tree coming out. Horizon Walker. So hopefully that we don't see the same pattern we saw with like Inquisitive or Alchemist, where it's like really, really, really strong, and then they wait forever to do the required balance changes. I just would like to see them be a little bit proactive. I don't think they are, like, I have to emphasize again, I don't think, I don't have I'm not a conspiracy theorist to where I think they're intentionally releasing stuff overpowered, letting it linger to sell, and then nerfing it after its primetime sales are done. But I will certainly say that some of the things, some of what they've done here is certainly can give that impression, and certainly needlessly, at a minimum, it can needlessly upset players. So all I would say is, SSG, I would say just be more proactive in your nerfs. They don't have to be perfect. Even if they're not, over nerf them a little bit. After 3 months, you can always buff them later. Okay, guys, so yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Let me know what you guys think about all these changes. I would be interested in reading your comments as always. And, let me know if there's anything you felt I didn't mention that I should have mentioned, or if I got anything wrong, please correct me. Like, here's the thing, guys, is I can't know. I put a lot of time into reading the forums to make sure I was as accurate as possible with the stuff that I'm kind of reporting here, but I'm only one person. I'm human, and I can possibly make mistakes. So I rely on my viewers to correct me if I make a mistake. So if I've made a mistake, or if I've missed something, or if I've left something important out, please let me know, and I will, like I said in the beginning of the video, I will leave a pinned comment below, below at the top of the comment section, so that you can go down there, and if you're watching this video, you might want to check down there real quick to see if there's been anything updated. So if there's any updates or anything I missed or whatever, I will put it in a pinned comment, okay? Hey guys, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you enjoyed. I will see you all next time. Have a good one. Take care.